This is not a story about rumors. It is not about headlines, online theories, or what strangers argue about late at night. This is a story about realization, the kind that arrives slowly, quietly, and far too late to be undone. For years, the man at the center of the story believed he understood the shape of his life. He believed the hardest choices were already behind him. He believed that walking away had cost him everything he was ever going to lose. But some truths don't reveal themselves at the moment of departure. They wait, they settle, and then when the noise finally fades, they rise. At 41, he was no longer the person the world remembered. He wasn't the defiant younger son or the smiling public figure framed by ceremony and duty. He was something far less visible and far more fragile, a man who had trusted silence and only later realized what silence had protected. It didn't begin with confrontation. It didn't begin with anger. It began with an envelope. It was waiting for him on a desk in a quiet room, its surface plain, its weight heavier than paper should be. No markings, no explanation, just a single line printed neatly across the front. Private confirmation. He didn't open it right away. His hands hovered, uncertain, as if instinct already understood what reason had not yet accepted. Outside the room, life continued uninterrupted. Laughter echoed down the hall, the familiar grounding sounds of children at play, sounds that had once been proof that every sacrifice had been worth it. But now, those sounds carried something else. Not comfort, context. Because the envelope wasn't about curiosity, it wasn't about reassurance. It was about finality. And finality changes the meaning of everything that comes after it. The doubt hadn't arrived suddenly. It had been building for months, even years, assembling itself out of moments too small to confront directly, conversations that ended too quickly, decisions that had already been made before he was told, details explained away as handled, private, or unnecessary to worry about. He accepted those explanations because trust demands surrender, because love asks you not to interrogate every inconsistency, because questioning the foundations of your life feels more dangerous than standing on them blindly. But silence has a cost. Late at night, he would replay fragments of memory without meaning to. Timelines that didn't quite align, appointments he hadn't attended, medical discussions that felt incomplete, names never given, answers delivered with calm certainty but no substance behind them. Each time doubt surfaced, he pushed it down, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging the possibility that the life he had defended so fiercely might not have been built on shared truth. The first child's arrival should have erased every question, and emotionally it did. Joy has a way of overwhelming logic, but even in that joy, there were absences. Announcements delayed, details obscured, records sealed more tightly than expected. He noticed, and he chose not to ask. The second time, coincidence began to strain. Processes changed, explanations shortened, disappearances occurred without clarity. When he asked where, how, or why, the answers softened into reassurance rather than information. He was told not to worry. He was told everything was under control. At some point, doubt stopped feeling disloyal and started feeling necessary. Not suspicion of others, preservation of self. The envelope had arrived weeks later, without warning, no sender, no return address, just an invitation to know what had been carefully kept out of reach. He sat with it longer than he should have, because once knowledge enters your life, it doesn't leave. It reshapes memory, it reframes love, it redraws identity. When he finally opened it, the language inside was clinical, detached, almost kind in its precision. No emotion, no accusation, just conclusions. He read it once, then again, then a third time. The words didn't change. What broke him wasn't rage. It wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was understanding. The realization that choices had been made without him, that silence hadn't been accidental, that truth had been managed, filtered, delayed, until it no longer threatened the structure built around it. And in that moment, he understood something far worse than deception. He hadn't been protected, he had been excluded.
He didn't react the way people imagine men react when their lives fracture. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, no immediate confrontation. Shock doesn't demand chaos. It demands stillness, time, space to absorb what can no longer be unseen. The children were unchanged. That was the cruelest part. Their laughter still filled the house. Their presence still anchored him. Love, at least, had survived intact, but certainty had not. Trust, once compromised, doesn't collapse loudly. It erodes. It turns memory into a series of questions. It makes every reassurance retroactive. He began to look backward, not to rewrite the past, but to finally understand it. Moments that once felt confusing now felt deliberate. Explanations that once sounded protective now sounded procedural. When he reached out quietly for answers, the responses followed a pattern he would come to recognize: careful language, legal framing, emphasis on stability, on avoiding disruption, on preventing consequences. The message was subtle but consistent. Silence had been chosen because it worked, not because it was right. He learned that concerns had surfaced early, that questions had been raised and then quietly closed, that decisions had been justified as necessary, as compassionate, as unavoidable. He wasn't shielded from harm, he was managed. When the conversation finally happened, the one he had delayed, avoided, and rehearsed in his head 1,000 times, it wasn't explosive. It was tired, heavy, exhausted by years of carrying something that could never stay buried forever. Explanations arrived wrapped in fear, in urgency, in claims of protection. He was told that circumstances had been complicated, that choices had been made under pressure, that telling him earlier would have risked everything. What hurt most wasn't what had been done. It was the assumption behind it, the belief that he couldn't be trusted with the truth of his own life. That belief shattered something fundamental. He realized then that silence is not neutral. It is active. It shapes outcomes. It decides who holds agency and who doesn't. And once silence becomes a habit, it stops feeling like deception and starts feeling like strategy. He didn't go public, not because he feared fallout, but because truth doesn't require spectacle to be real. Some reckonings are private. Some decisions are made without witnesses. What mattered was what came next. He began to understand how institutions prioritize continuity over individuals, how systems protect themselves by narrowing access to information, how easily protection turns into control when consent is removed. And so, he made a decision of his own. No more filtered truths. No more reassurances without substance. No more accepting silence as kindness. If stability required omission, it wasn't stability worth preserving. The story didn't end with exposure. It didn't end with blame. It ended with choice. A choice to reclaim agency. A choice to face reality without mediation. A choice to refuse silence, even when silence would have been easier. Because once a person understands how thoroughly silence can rewrite their life, they never mistake quiet for peace again. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with revelation, but with what happens after a man decides he will no longer live inside a version of events written without him.